welcome everyone to this new edition of our Behind the Scenes Seminar series. I'm Sabrine Toussard, an economist at the University of Oxford, joined by Vatsal Kandelwal, who is from Exeter, also an economist. And today we have the great pleasure to have James Druckman join us from Rochester. Jamie, you're a political scientist. You have very wide interests. You worked with researchers across the social sciences. You thought a lot about polarization, thinking both within and outside of science, thinking about disagreements, science communication, methodology. So we are incredibly excited to have you. We couldn't think of someone better for this type of format. Vatsal is gonna walk us through the logistics for this seminar, and then we'll look forward to hearing more about the project, Jamie.
Thank you so much for attending the seminar. I'm just going to walk you through the format. So Jamie is going to give us an introduction to the paper for the first 10 to 15 minutes, after which I'll share the link of the survey with you, which you can fill at your own pace. And then we'll start discussing the results after that. I've posted the link to the consent form on the chat for any of you who haven't seen it so that you can take a look. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Jamie, do you want to share your screen?
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I'm having trouble finding. Oh, okay. So, that work?
Yes, we can see a Word document. Yeah, now we can see one.
Okay, great. Okay, well, thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be here as a huge fan of Seminar and the prior versions of this. It's really a nice honor. I also want to thank Wes Scogan for coming. He's one of my first professors. So it's nice to see you, Wes. And so the paper that I'm going to present is the paper at the top of the page, which ended up coming out entitled "The File Drawer Problem in the Social Science Survey Experiments," which ended up being a kind of a brief report in PNAS. And so we can talk about how it became that later in the seminar. And so the paper was really building directly on a fairly well-known paper that was published in Science in 2014 entitled "Publication Bias in the Social Sciences: Unlocking the File Drawer" by Annie Franco, Neil Malhotra, and Gabor Simonovitz. And so to give just a little bit of background, which is probably familiar to most of the people in the seminar, right, there's long been this kind of big question in the social sciences about the role of publication bias, and there are lots of different sources of publication biases. So in a broad sense, we can think of that as when factors orthogonal to the quality of the research influence publication decisions. In a more narrow sense, the one that we mostly talk about is what is called the file drawer bias, which was a term coined in, I think, 1979 by Rosenthal. And the idea here is that you favor statistically significant results regardless of quality. And so this was kind of a big question, right? Because we typically only see significant results. So therefore, what is really going on if we're seeing that, if we're only seeing significant results? It's a hard thing to test, right? Because we usually don't have access to the things that we can't see. And put another way, if there aren't publications of insignificant results, then it's very hard to know kind of what we're missing. So there are lots of approaches. There are a lot of statistical approaches to estimating this. There's been a long line of literature on this. The paper on which we were building was, as I mentioned, this paper by Franco et al. And what they did was pretty clever, is they exploited this grant program, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. It's a grant program where people apply to do survey experiments. And so what happens is people get accepted, they can implement their survey experiments, and then we know that the data are there. We know what the data look like. We know that they have data. And so we kind of have that full universe of data collected. And then we can kind of look project by project, what was published and what was not published, and is that related to statistical significance? And what they found in their original paper was that studies with significant results were 40 percentage points more likely to be published than those with no results. So very large publication bias or file drawer bias. And they also found that a lot of that bias stems from authors discontinuing the paper writing process when they found no results. Once people wrote it up, there was only a 5 percentage point bias. So put another way, a lot of this was, you can almost think of this as a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? You get a no result, you don't write it up. Perhaps, we don't know what the journal process would have necessarily bred, but a lot of this was kind of at the author stage rather than the journal decision stage. So we were very motivated by this question. We were also motivated by other work, mostly from physical and medical sciences, that explores factors that correlate with research productivity more generally. Kind of what leads one to be more productive or less productive, or pursue a project or not pursue a project. And so that was kind of a secondary thing that was inspiring what we were doing. And so our goals in doing this were to replicate Franco et al. Franco et al.'s data were from 2002 to 2012. So we wanted to kind of do what they did, but from 2012 to 2018, which we thought was a particularly interesting timing insofar as around 2012 is when the open science movement was really becoming a much more kind of broadly discussed, and different reforms were done at journals. And there were clear efforts to be made to not to publish null results when they occurred. And so it was interesting timing in that sense. We also moved beyond what they did insofar as they were only able to look at the people who were accepted into the survey experiment program. We actually were able to look at people who also were not accepted into the survey experiment program. And then we also wanted to look at other parts of the research process, as I kind of just intimated. So let me briefly tell you about this survey program. Some of you might be familiar with it. It's called Time-Sharing Experiments in the Social Sciences. And I should mention that I've been a co-PI of this since 2012. And so what it is, it's a National Science Foundation initiative, American National Science Foundation initiative. And it conducts survey experiments on probability samples of American adults, although actually you can do teenagers as well. And so basically what happens is you can put in an application. It's about a 5-page application. It gets peer reviewed, and then there's a decision made either to move forward and fund your survey experiment on the vendor which the program works with, or not. And so the acceptance rates historically is about 13%. I think it varies a little bit over time. Right now, the program is on a hiatus where we're waiting for the National Science Foundation to figure out if they have funds or not, so just in case anybody wanted to explore that more. But we're hoping that we kind of restart in December. That's the hope. And so there's been a lot of these projects over time. And so this you can imagine this is what Franco et al. Did, right? They took the set of accepted projects, and then they were able to look at what was published and not published. So what we did was we basically have the list of people who were accepted and not accepted, and we did. I'm going to skip over that. And we did a big survey, and we took the population of 794 applicant proposals, meaning kind of some people apply multiple times. So the unit of analysis here is the applicant by proposal. And we took the universe of those applicants from 2012 to January 2018. We got about 544 to respond. And we were able to know, since we had the population, we were able to kind of see if it varied from the population in terms of gender, race, ethnicity, and position. And it seemed to line up pretty well. And so what we did, I'm not going to talk through all of this, but we measured a bunch of things. We measured funding decision, which is whether were you accepted or not accepted. So in that sense, it was an internal audit of our own activities, like what was affecting whether we were funding things or not. We measured perseverance. So this is something we were particularly interested in. If you're not funded, then we asked people, did they pursue the project? Did they persevere in the face of the rejection, and then collect data themselves and kind of what happened with that project as they went down the line. We asked people if they wrote a paper or not. If they did persevere, or if they were accepted by test, we asked them if they wrote a paper, to get at the point that Franco et al. Found earlier. We asked whether it was published. We asked a bunch of questions about the publication outlet, and then we asked about statistical significance. And one issue that comes up in all of this work is we were asking people to self-report statistical significance rather than reanalyze their data themselves. And in part, both approaches are interesting, but in part, because this is a perceptual thing in terms of pursuing a project, at least at the writing stage, the perception is a relevant data point. So you could also reanalyze, and we did do some reanalysis as well, but that's not part of this project. per se. So what did we find? I'm not going to, I'll just skip over the regression and kind of show you some highlights of the main points. In terms of funding and perseverance, I'll talk about first. Basically, the odds of being funded increased with having relatively more research time and decreased with the number of students advised. So, you know, there's something about basically having time to kind of prepare a better proposal, I think. And then it also increased with age and the number of published articles, which we presume is reflecting experience. And so I don't know, we weren't sure if these are particularly interesting or not, but it seems that time is a really important part of kind of writing a grant application that is successful, right? And so the idea is if you're advising more students, you might have less time. In terms of kind of perseverance, what we thought this was really kind of a nice finding, or insofar as of those that were not accepted for data collection, about nearly 75% of them still persevered and pursued their project. We also asked how they persevered, so we have data on that. Most of them went to cheaper data sources that they were able to get data on, and so this was a little bit of a surprise. We didn't expect that high percentage of people to be persevering. And the variables that affect perseverance are similar to the variables that affected funding. You persevere more if you have more time. You persevere less if you have more students to advise. We also found age increased the likelihood of persevering. And we found kind of risk attitudes. If you're more risk prone, you were more likely to persevere, which makes sense. And so those are kind of, you know, some descriptive findings on those steps in the research process. Interesting, we didn't find any evidence that resources affected perseverance. And so size of research budget, access to internal grants were unrelated to persevering. That probably largely reflects because most of the platforms that the data ended up being collected on were labor markets, which can be done, you know, fairly cheaply, is what we suspect. Okay, let us turn to kind of the publication file drawer bias findings, and I'll walk you through this table because it's not the prettiest table. We break out looking first at test researchers, and then we also look at the persevering researchers. So these are people who actually analyze their data, right? If they didn't analyze their data, we can't see if there was a publication bias from statistically significant result. And so the first thing to look at is just this row, the published role. So this is the kind of the n-line publication bias. And what we see, right, for test researchers, we see a pretty clear 30 percentage points or so file drawer bias. And then for persevering researchers, we also find a pretty clear file drawer bias. And so that's kind of, you know, not a great finding. I mean, it's an interesting finding. We were hoping to not find as much of a file drawer bias at this point. I'll kind of compare directly with Franco et al. In a moment. The next interesting thing to look at, though, is this row. So these are papers that were submitted to journals but not published. And so what we see here is, right, statistically significant results. So if you just look at test researchers, right, 16% of them were submitted but not published, whereas only about 11% of not statistically significant were submitted for not published. So what this suggests, and we find kind of similar dynamics in the persevering research. So what this suggests is at the point of submission, not only is there's no clear bias that the journals themselves have any kind of preference for statistically significant or insignificant results, and if anything, they actually seem to have a slight preference for insignificant results. Insofar as if you're not significant, you're less likely to fall into this group, right? You're less likely to be submitting but not getting published. And so that's kind of an interesting finding, we thought, as well. And then finally, I'm going to skip the second row and just go to the not written row. And we find a similar thing that Franco et al. Found, right? So people who are finding not statistically significant results were substantially less likely to write up their findings. So this is the kind of the same dynamic that Franco et al. Found as well. So to the extent that there is a file drawer bias in this domain of survey experiments, it does seem to be reflecting the process of not writing up the paper. Of course, we don't know if there's some selection in not writing up the paper and there's statistically insignificant results. Might just be poorly designed studies. That would be kind of an interesting kind of next question to be asked. And then finally, and then I'll kind of end it with this. This is just, again, this is not the easiest thing to read, but this is just our comparison with Franco et al. So if you just look at the first panel there, the green is not written up. The green is Franco et al. And so they were finding about 65% were not writing up insignificant results. And we were finding kind of in our persevering and test researchers, a much smaller percentage were not writing up their results. And then if you go to the kind of the end line for the insignificant results, again, we were finding a much smaller percentage of insignificant results were not being published. So even though what I just presented was clear evidence of file drawer bias, it actually is substantially smaller than what Franco et al. Found. So that we do find a decline in the extent of that bias. Again, we can't make a causal claim of why there's a decline in that bias, but it does align with kind of a change in kind of how researchers think about science and kind of think about null results, which was clearly occurring around the point at which our data started and which their data ended. And so that's the paper, or kind of a little bit more of the paper. And so yeah, I think I'll end it with that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jamie. Super interesting. So Vatsal just shared in the chat the link to the survey. So we're gonna ask you questions about how you think the project went. We were discussing with Jamie that's kind of a meta at this point, because this is also a paper about sort of the file drawers and thinking about the behind the scenes of research. So let's see what happened there. And meanwhile, we're just going to have a short discussion around the research agenda. How did you come to work on this topic? And if you can tell us a little bit about the team also on the paper.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So, as a PI of tests, when the Franco et al. Paper came out, we were quite excited. We didn't even know they had been working on it, so we were unaware, and it came out. And some of you who are old enough might remember that this paper that got a fair amount of kind of discussion and publicity, I think, because it is a really clever test of the publication bias. And so I think it was something that was in the back. So the authors are myself, and Jeremy Fries is another co-PI of tests. I'll mention the third and the author, who's the first author on the paper, in a moment, and how he kind of became involved. And so I think this was in the back of our mind as something to do at some point, but of course we had to wait some years to pass. And so in that sense, the idea was probably in some amorphous fashion planted, around 2015, but more actively, I think it was planted around 2018 or so, when we kind of actually started to kind of take initiative to do this. And then we wrote this extremely complex survey. So because as I kind of got at, we were asking all these other things beyond, did you publish your paper or not? And so we also asked things that I didn't mention, like, did you present it? Where did you present it? For people who didn't use tests, or we asked things about pilot data. Where did you get your pilot data? What did your pilot data show? And for people who persevered, we kind of asked them, where did you get your data? How much did it cost? How long did it take to collect? We asked kind of all kinds. It was a very long survey. We incentivized people to kind of do this, and we also kind of guilted them into it a little bit, saying, like, this would be important for the test program. And so we ended up with this pretty complex data set. And so I don't think we had fully thought through kind of because there were so many contingencies in the data set, right? Because it depended, were you accepted or not? And then if you were accepted, if you collected the data or not? And then if you collected the data, did you analyze it or not? And so the data set was fairly complex. And I think for Jeremy and I just didn't have the time to really get the data organized. And so Philip, it's actually a great story. So Philip was a graduate student at the time at Texas, and he was working on a distinct project with Aaron Hartman and Steve Jesse. And they were doing something else with test infrastructure data that they ended up publishing in Political Analysis, so kind of looking at kind of an aspect of the sampling that the test vendor uses. And they were just doing this really fascinating work. And so we had been in touch with them kind of as they were doing that work. And so then we just kind of approached Philip and we said, you obviously are fairly familiar with how test works now. And would you be interested in kind of joining our project? And kind of we have this fairly unwieldy data set that needs organization. And kind of he joined on. He was amazing. He kind of got the data all organized, had a lot of great ideas. And so that's how the team kind of came about.
Awesome. How do you think about forming teams in general? Do you think what works better for you? Small teams, large teams? only political science. Jeremy is not from, I think he's from sociology. Is that correct?
He's a sociologist. Yes.
Yeah. How do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, I think as is first talking about size, it's been an interesting experience for me personally because as is kind of the trend in the social sciences is this kind of rise of larger research teams. I think that's been documented a little bit. And I kind of have followed that trend, not necessarily intentionally, but I kind of found myself in the last like 6 or so years being part of two fairly large research teams with probably, kind of 5 to 7 core people, and then a lot of people kind of around those core people. And I've had really positive experiences. I don't know if I'm in a position to kind of say what leads to a positive or negative experience on those. I think there's been a fair amount written already, including by Ben Jones at Northwestern, has written quite a bit on this, which which are worth reading because they were helpful for me in entering these teams. Both those teams are these larger teams that I was a part of are multidisciplinary. I mean, I've always kind of enjoyed multidisciplinary work. I had the kind of privilege of being went to Northwestern where Wes was one of my professors, and then I taught there for 20 years, and it's an extremely interdisciplinary university. And there's an Institute for Policy Research which facilitates that. So I think and that's where I met Jeremy actually, because he was also at Northwestern at the time. And so I think that just became like a natural inclination in some sense. And yeah, I've always enjoyed that, because you share a kind of an interest in a substantive question. And then that seems to be, to me, kind of more defining of having common views of working together than kind of disciplinary background. But again, it's probably idiosyncratic a little bit as well.
Yeah, super interesting. Yeah, to hear about how the institutional, if the institutional effect, right, of being like within the same building or the same university can also have an impact, a strong impact on collaborations in general. For those of you who haven't taken the survey yet and who still want to make an attempt, we'll have still a couple minutes to do that. I just wanted to follow up a little bit on this interdisciplinarity and what do you think is the necessary condition for, or what are the necessary conditions for this to work? So do you think that there were some cases where, that was harder because of, I don't know, uncommon, a lack of common understanding on methods, on language? What's your sense on that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I do think it's advantageous if you're at the same institution. Again, just speaking strictly from my own experience, I really don't want to generalize. But from my own experience, if you're working across disciplines, I found it easier to do that when you're in the same institutional setting, in part because I think you can get to know the person a little bit more. You kind of attend talks that they might give, internal talks at the university, and so you kind of develop a sense of how they think about things. And in that way, I think that facilitated working with people. And then what I've also learned is you kind of do that, and then you kind of can work with people who have worked with those people or former students of those people, which I've done as well. So I've worked with kind of colleagues or students of the people that I collaborated with, that some of whom I never met, but they kind of I know how they're thinking about things as well. And so I think I think that's super helpful. Just insofar as it eases understanding where they're coming from and what motivates them, and maybe kind of a guess at whether or not you're going to kind of be in line in how you think about things, particularly for interdisciplinary collaborations. Now, I've certainly had some interdisciplinary collaborations where that was not the case, but just kind of thinking about them, I think they were not bad by any sense, but I think that there was a kind of a more of a cost and even kind of trying to understand each other, and communication was probably not as easy. Even kind of figuring out how the infrastructure to kind of set up the projects was a little bit different, right? Like you use different platforms, and kind of some people use GitHub and some people are using Google Drive, and like things like that can become pretty they sound small, but they become kind of a cost in the sense. In fact, I just yesterday, right, I'm collaborating with some people on something. Who, you know, they're all sociologists, I guess, different sociologists, and they had put something in their OneDrive. They're at UBC, British Columbia. They're great, but I couldn't access the OneDrive, so I couldn't kind of work on my revisions at the time. And so, you know, I think again that kind of having that shared institutional experience is helpful, but again, not necessary by any sense.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, I didn't think about some of these aspects, but indeed, all the setup costs can become like so much larger when you don't even share. Yeah, you don't use the same tools and so on. Cool. Well, let's now talk a little bit about the behind the scenes of this project then. So Vatsal is going to share the outcome.
Yes, I'll just share my screen now, so you should be able to see my screen. All right. So the first question we asked the audience was, how many years do you think it took the researchers to go from conceiving the idea to getting it published? And that's the response. And Jamie's answer was 7 years. Maybe we take one more question, one more question, Jamie, and then we go into discussion if you want, or we can chat about this if you want to talk about it right now.
I mean, I could briefly say why it took 7 years, I suppose. Yeah, it took 7 years, I guess, because I was thinking of the starting point as 2018, which is when we really started to draft a survey, and then it was published in 2025. So that would be 7 years. I assume I could go into what happened, but why don't we wait and kind of see like why it took 7 years? Because I think, at least I think, and then writing up this presentation, you know, it's kind of like, why did this take 7 years? Because it's kind of straightforward. But yeah, I guess that's part of the story.
Jamie, do you think that's representative of the time you spend on on projects in general, or is that like really more in the long tail of your distribution?
I think it's probably not at the edge of the tail, but probably kind of for a paper, which you know, there's just one paper. I think it's probably longer than I would take typically. Part of this, though, I should say, I'd say about a year, at least a year, maybe a year and a half. It kind of just sat, in part because we didn't have time and the data to organize the data, which again was, you know, a lesson, which I often kind of will impart when I teach like a class on survey methods or experimental design, about kind of anticipating what your data look like, and we didn't do a very good job at that. And so there was a little bit of kind of built in from that, which was a particularly unique situation in this project.
All right. Okay. Let's take the next question. How many times do you think the presenter presented the paper before submission? And this is what the audience said. So the majority say 1 to 2 times. And that's also what you said. Then we have a couple of questions on peer review. Should we go ahead? Okay. So then how many journals do you think the researchers submitted the paper to before it was accepted? Wow, the audience is getting things right. And then we have a question on how many rounds of revision did it go through? And wow, okay, the majority said 2, and the right answer is 1 revision. And finally, how much time did it take the researchers to address the comments of the referees? This is what the audience's response looks like. And you actually said 0.5, so half a month, which is I think unusually fast, I would say. So yeah, do you want to talk about the peer review process now? Yeah.
Yes. So the peer review process was an interesting experience, and so we probably finished the first draft of the paper. I don't know, around 2021 or right around there. Don't quote me on these exact dates. I don't know. I don't remember the exact date of the first submission, but we submitted around then to a political science journal, that with a paper that kind of put more emphasis on the perseverance results, and kind of only briefly talked about the file drawer results, in part because I think at the time we thought the perseverance results were a little bit more interesting. And that review process probably was at the journal for 6 or 7 months. And then it got 2 negative reviews, and the editors seemed to not like the paper at all. And it seemed like they just didn't think it was a good fit for the journal. They didn't think that it was a very interesting topic. And so that was kind of just, it didn't go anywhere from there. So then we probably took about a couple months to kind of, I don't know if, to the extent, I don't know if we really addressed the comments of the reviews from that, but we rather just completely reconfigured the paper. So it looked a lot like what I presented. So that was, what I presented was based on the version of the paper that we reconfigured. We then submitted that version of the paper to one of the kind of major political science journals, kind of one of the more general political science journals, where it kind of took about 11 months to get a review, which is pretty on the long end for political science. We kept checking in. I mean, after about 7 months, we kind of checked in kind of every month, and they seemed to have 2 reviews for quite some time. And then we kind of finally got a decision, which was a reject. 2 of the reviews were quite positive. The third negative review was very negative, and it basically focused on, they didn't think that our response rate in the survey was sufficiently high, which I'm still a little bit confused about. And what was their other? Oh, they didn't like I had to go back and look at my news. So it was interesting to go back and read these reviews, right? Because like, so and they didn't like that we had self-reported statistical significance rather than kind of reanalyzing all the data ourselves, which was part of why I kind of pointed that out before, that there was a reason that we did that. So I actually was a bit frustrated with that decision. So for only the second time in my career, I actually appealed the decision, meaning that I wrote the editors and I kind of asked them for more explication. I think part of that frustration was just a very long wait. And you know, that was especially because one of the co-authors was applying on the job market, and you know, so it wasn't great for him. And so but the appeal, they accepted the appeal, so we kind of wrote like why we thought that third review was we could address, we thought we could address it, but they didn't. They just kind of said they agreed with the third review, so which was fine. They were very fast so it didn't really delay the paper any further. They were very efficient in kind of dealing with the review and very professional. So that, you know, that's their prerogative, and I mean, I think editors have prerogative to do what they think is best. So so at that point, we kind of like, it'd been a while, right? Because we had kind of been through 2 journals, and kind of had 2 different versions of the paper. And at that point, we decided like, well, we're going to kind of change in a very different direction than the first version of the paper, and we cut out all of the persevering stuff, because that just seemed to distract people a little bit from the file drawer bias results. And so we kind of removed all of that from the paper, the kind of what drove funding decisions and the kind of what drove perseverance, and we just made it kind of, here's a replication of the Franco et al. Paper, but it with including the test researchers and the kind of people who were rejected by test. And we wrote it into a, you know, this brief note. So you may have noticed the PNAS paper that was ultimately published was a note. So I think it's like 1,500 words. I think that is the length of those papers, plus 2 tables or figures. So we submitted it there, and it went very fast and very smooth there. So we went there, and the interesting thing is the editor, the person who was the editor, and the reviewers were much more from the world of kind of studying kind of publication bias, than I think that we had gotten in the previous iterations. And we got kind of, you know, 2 useful reviews back. One had very few comments. The other kind of made suggestions to kind of configure or kind of situate the work in the broader publication bias literature. It was useful, but it was mostly, you know, it was very useful, but it was mostly just reframing and kind of adding some citations, which is why it was kind of revised so quickly. And then we resubmitted, and it was accepted pretty quickly. So it was an interesting process for sure, insofar as the paper content kind of changed throughout, and you know, then you kind of have to. We ended up, you know, as Sev kind of pointed out, there's kind of a meta question here, insofar as we actually, you know, there's a file drawer aspect of our paper here, like those persevering results were like they're not in the public domain, they're not out there. and the test funding results are not in the public domain right now, so they're not out there either. So that is a kind of an irony to the whole process.
Very interesting. I wanted to ask you a question about how you decide on which outlet to submit to in general. How do you think about that? And here, of course, there is a big challenge because, you know, for these papers are more about meta science. It's not clear meta science belongs to every field and therefore to no field in a sense.
Yes.
And so I think that creates further challenges. I was wondering what your views are on that and how do you approach the submission process for projects generally and this type of project as well?
Yeah, it's such a great question, and I mean, I think in terms of projects generally, it has become interesting with the rise of kind of these general science journals and kind of their place and kind of how departments view their place in kind of like promotion and tenure decisions, and you know, I think that's highly variable. So maybe I'll cycle back to that, but first let me talk about this paper. I think we were so we wrote we shared kind of the results with the authors of Franco et al. Neil Malhotra really thought we should kind of submit it to Science. We didn't think that it warranted like a science publication, so we decided to kind of not do that. So then we kind of thought like, well, of the test studies, political science as a discipline make up a plurality of them. And we kind of thought that there had been articles in political science about publication bias. We thought that kind of the emphasis on the perseverance side of things was interesting, but not kind of a major finding per se. So that first version, we just thought we would try, which was a kind of mid-level political science journal. So I think that was the initial decision. I don't think we kind of have fully formed thoughts of what we were going to do if we were going to kind of then write a different paper if that paper had been accepted or not. I think we had just not really thought about it very much. Then once we wrote the second version, and we kind of really liked the second version, which was quite different, and kind of we try to kind of put forth this kind of model of how kind of the empirical part of social science works, and so we thought political science journal for similar reasons, and I think also because the first author, my vague memory is right, he was on the job market and he's a political scientist, and political science, there are many political scientists who would probably value a high kind of one of the major general political science journals over a general science journal, and so I think that's why we went to there. But then once that rejection came in, I think we were like, okay, it's been a while. We would really like to get these file drawer results out there. And it was very nice. Neil Malhotra was very encouraging through all this process because we kind of shared the outcomes. And so then we just kind of sent it to PNAS, which we, thought might get and did get reviewers who are coming from quite a different perspective. As a general matter, I think I'm still figuring that out. It's really kind of different experiences. At science journals versus kind of political science journals, with different trade-offs. So yeah, I don't know if I've figured that out fully yet.
Is your impression that they're faster than political science journals in general, or yeah, what's the difference?
I think on average in general, but I think there are some exceptions because there are kind of growing number of these science journals, and I think some of them are slower. But I think on average they are faster for no other reason, right? A lot of them have professional editorial staffs, and so this is their full-time job of these people, and so they're able to commit more of their selves to processing manuscripts and moving quickly, and so I do think they're faster. I think they're variable by journal, and I don't know if I want to start talking about particular journals, but yeah, I think kind of some of them seem more kind of clubby than others, right? Some of them kind of are more like, you're likely to get an editor you might know, and that might help because some of them have a professional staff, but then they kind of pull in a academic editor, whereas others kind of do it all themselves. And so I think there are different processes in that respect.
I wanted to ask one more question about the submission process, which is after rejection, of course, there are different routes you can take. And one of them is to wait and to change the manuscripts essentially, reply to the reviewers, address their comments, but in the end, you don't know if the comments are right or which ones are the most valuable, or the likelihood even that you're going to get the same reviewer in the next submission. What's your view on how far you should go in terms of addressing reviewers' comments following a rejection, and how long do you typically tend to wait after rejection? Do you have a piece of advice on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's for me, it's variable in part by who co-authors might be, and kind of, so it's usually kind of collaborative decision. And if the co-author is an earlier career scholar, if this paper is important for their kind of career, then we would try to kind of be more quick. And so I think in terms of how fast, it's a lot of variance for me in terms of how fast I might turn things around. Just with an enormous range. So I don't think I can clearly answer that. In terms of kind of responding to reviewers, that's definitely something I've kind of struggled with over responding to reviewers when a paper is rejected, have struggled with over time. And I think in the end, I've kind of come to the conclusion that, in the end, it's kind of your paper and your work. And so you don't want to do anything that you think would make the work in your eyes not as good. And so you kind of have to kind of, one, don't do anything that you think is going to decrease the quality of the work. And I think you could obviously think of kind of reasons why you might want to do that. Maybe it increases the publication likelihood. But I think in the end, that's a pretty good heuristic overall. And then try to address things that are addressable. And then there's kind of that big category of things that are like big comments that you think might make the paper better, but they also might lead it in a different direction, or be like an enormous task that you don't have the time for. It would like delay it for years potentially. And those are the hard decisions. Yeah, again, I think that's project specific. So I don't have great advice on exactly how to handle those, other than sitting on a paper. There's a lot of journals and there's a lot of papers, and so I guess my general advice on that is you never get too tied to one particular paper. It's going to be a lot of them.
Good.
All right, let's take a few more questions now. The next question is, how much do you think the final results aligned with the presenter's original prior? And you said mostly aligned, and that's what the audience also said. And then we have a question related to what we've been speaking about. How many times do you think the pitch of the paper was revised? You said twice. So I actually have a follow-up question on that. When revising the pitch, it often means, as it did in your case, that you have to drop certain parts of the paper, which is an incredibly difficult thing to do, especially when you've been working on something for 7 years, and then you have to drop this huge set of results that you presented to us. How easy was that to do, and was that a unanimous decision that you reached with your, I'm assuming it definitely was a unanimous decision, but how easy was it to drop those results? And also, since then, have you thought about publishing them elsewhere?
So it was a unanimous decision. I think in this case, because it had been a long process, it was not a particularly hard decision. And in this case also, there was kind of a clear distinction of kind of what both set of results that we did, like dropping them didn't really have an influence. In my mind, it narrowed the paper, but it didn't really influence kind of the presentation of the results that were ultimately published. And so it wasn't a super hard decision, because people were kind of they were having a difficult time with having so much in one paper. And so 2 more points. One, kind of in response to the question of, have we thought about doing stuff with the rest? I think at this point, because it's been so many years, what we've thought about more is just, those data ended in 2018, so we can probably just collect data again, and possibly use the data that we had to kind of extend, right? So if we publish those results, it would probably become part of like another data collection where we extended the data like through 2024, perhaps, if we did it like in 2026, if that makes sense. And so, so I think that's the answer to that. I think in terms of like cutting more generally, I don't generally have I mean, there's two parts to that. There's kind of the scientific part, right? You know, your file drawing away stuff. And so I think there's that, which is uncomfortable, because you'd rather not do that. And so, if this paper had been in a different journal in a different format, I'm quite sure we would have at least tried to put these other results in an appendix or kind of somehow other reference them. It turns out in PNAS for brief reports, they have very strict limits on what you can put even in an appendix. And so we kind of weren't able to do that. And so I think I kind of would have done that. So there's kind of the kind of knowledge production part of cutting out results. And then there's kind of the personal decision, like of a feeling of loss, right? Like I put so much into this. I don't have a, I think people are very variable in that. I think one of my professors in graduate school always had this rule, where he said, when in doubt, cut it out. And so I just kind of like, I think he was talking more about writing, but I think I kind of internalized that in a more general sense. And so, you know, I definitely developed doubt about including that stuff in the paper. So in terms of kind of the loss, I kind of like, well, it's hard. I guess I kind of keep telling myself the process is really messy, and you're just going to end up doing a lot of stuff that never sees the light of day, right? Like, I mean, sure, I mean, if you haven't experienced this yet, then you're very lucky. But like for me at least, I feel like so much of my time, like I go back and I think about like what did I do in the last like 3 weeks or 2 weeks on like some project, and it turns out like very little of what I did turned out to be very useful in the end, but it's part of the process. Like it's just process. Like I wouldn't have gotten to where I got if I didn't go through the stuff that I ended up not using, in a more general sense. Which is why this is a great initiative, because to kind of uncover that process.
Awesome. And we're learning that your loss aversion parameter is very low. So that's good. Not suffering from loss aversion as much as I do.
Yeah, yeah. I think that was just really kind of drilled into me. Yeah.
All right. Okay. The next question is about writing. So once the pitch was finalized, how many times was the introduction changed for stylistic reasons? This was 1 to 3 in your case. And do you want to talk about the writing process as well? Like how many versions of the introduction do you usually have before you submit a paper?
As a general matter, it's a hard question to answer because like versions of the introduction is an amorphous question. This is an amorphous element, right? Versions of the actual written introduction that make up the paper, I think I probably have on average kind of 1 to 3 before submission, but kind of the things that go into getting that version of the introduction, a lot more than 1 to 3, right? Like outlines, kind of thinking, kind of things in my head, random notes to myself. And so it would be great to kind of document that more systematically, right? Where, you know, I don't think I've ever kind of written down like, okay, that's a version that I had in my head of the introduction that did not work out. Or these are notes that I ended up not using. So I think I read this question as the literal introduction in like a finished paper. And so if we kind of change what the introduction means, then the answer would be much more. So especially if you start, yeah, I mean, right, these kind of random notes you write about, okay, I'm going to think about things like this. And then like, does that count? I think it does count. Then it'd be dramatically more.
Mhm.
I guess that kind of speaks to, you know, I guess I'd love to ask the two of you kind of like, how do you define the unit of analysis in that sense, right?
Yeah, some of these questions are very challenging precisely for that reason.
Yeah. Yeah, then we have this question on how challenging you found different parts of the research process. So this is the audience's response on a scale of 1 to 5. Yeah, most people thought that the data collection bit and the peer review were the most challenging. And this is what your responses look like, which is similar to the audiences in that you also said that peer review and data collection and analysis were the most difficult, and the easiest was coming up with the idea and writing and structuring, which is
we were copying somebody else at the initial idea. So, which I think, I mean, I'll comment on that actually. I mean, because I found throughout my research career that kind of taking somebody else's idea and kind of like building upon that, there's a very slippery slope between replication and generalization, and kind of thinking about like prior work and kind of like, how can I generalize that? How can I vary other aspects of that? I think is kind of often so not like a pure replication, but kind of, what can I do to kind of extend this prior work? I found that to be a useful approach.
And then we have a last question, after which I'm aware that we have 8 minutes left, so we can also open the floor to the audience to ask questions. But this was the last one about time use. Percentage of calendar time spent on each of these activities. And again, everyone thought that the most amount of time was spent on data collection, analysis, peer review, not so much. And this is what you said. For you, peer review, again, was the element that you spend most amount of time on.
Mostly waiting. I mean, it's a lot of waiting. Yeah.
Jamie, if you want to talk more about this, or we can also get questions from
I'll just one comment, and then I'll open it up, is that I definitely, in retrospect and kind of going back and reading the reviews and reflecting on the process in preparation for this, I do think kind of one thing that I did, I was like pretty more upset about the second rejection than I typically would be. I think it kind of hit me hard, and I think part of that was just the time, which is not like, and I shouldn't one should not let kind of time necessarily kind of shape your reactions and your emotions. And so I think that's something that, it was a lesson learned for me. Like, I should have thought more kind of like holding time constant, like what should have my reaction been. But at the time I'd been waiting, to hear. So I think that built up kind of these expectations. And so I think how to navigate those time expectations are important.
Yeah, that's as you might be aware in economics, that's something that we're really struggling with. We're incredibly slow, so that's also something we need to improve. All right, so we reached the end of the slides. Any questions from the audience? It was really, really super clear and very interesting. Yeah, Jillian.
Hi, I mostly just wanted to say thank you for doing this. I'm a PhD student and I'm navigating the peer review process and, navigating getting some rejections and trying to find new journals for my work. And I was feeling a little bummed out about it. And it's just really encouraging, Dr. Druckman, to I admire your work a lot. You're a rock star in political science, and just hearing your journey, especially with the peer review process, it was really affirming and reminded me that, this is part of the job. And so thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, that's so nice of you. Thank you. I appreciate it. And I would recommend reading. Sev just published this article in Nature about kind of dealing with failure. So I think that will be super useful. I don't know if Sev, if you want to put a link in the chat for that, just because I think everybody should read this article. And I will note, it is really hard, especially at the start of your career, as I've mentioned to Sev before. The first 15 things I submitted were rejected, like pretty badly. It was like not pleasant. And yeah, you just kind of have to keep trying, I guess. And then eventually you kind of figure out, I think, kind of how to frame things. It's a lot of framing. And have a good support network.
And I just shared the link to the article. Yeah. All right. Anything else? Otherwise, Jamie, thank you so much. It was super clear. I had read the paper and I still, learned many things about it. So it's, I think it really reveals how much we are losing through the publication process. And clearly you emphasized already that there are a lot of things that could not fit in the paper and that it was eventually published. But I think also thinking about scientific communication and how we can improve on that, even thinking about guidelines, publication guidelines, there are a lot of things about how we do research, how we conduct experiments, how we conduct projects, for which I feel like, and maybe that's something for the end, we could reflect on that. We could do so much better in terms of providing context for how the research was produced.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me and for doing this whole initiative. It's great.
Amazing.
Awesome.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.